Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston, Massachusetts on 17th of January 1706. He was the youngest son of a tallow chandler and soap boiler, and worked for his father from the ages of 10 to 12, much to his dissatisfaction. At the age of 12, he persuaded his father to apprentice him to his older brother James, who was a printer. He worked for his brother until he was 17 years old, when he left for Philadelphia to set out on his own. After working for different printers, he finally opened his own print shop in 1730 and began publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette, which would become one of the most successful newspapers in America. Shortly thereafter, he began to publish Poor Richard's Almanac, in which he would give his advice on life in the form of succinct aphorisms, along with the standard almanac fare of predictions of the weather and astronomical and astrological information. So successful was the Gazette that Franklin was able to retire from printing in 1748, though he would continue publishing Poor Richard's Almanac for an additional 10 years. At the time he retired, Franklin was worth an estimated $3 billion in 2010 dollars. After retiring from printing, he would go on to other pursuits, including natural philosophy, which was at the time what they called science. The 18th century saw the rise of experimentation, especially with electricity. Entrepreneurial traffic across the Atlantic from Britain to its colonies provided the ground on which the electrical sciences grew. Independent experimenters and investors exchanged ideas and apparatus across the Atlantic in an early dialogue between the continents. Francis Bacon set up a model whereby natural historians in the colonies would perform experiments, make observations, and collect samples to return to the natural philosophers in Europe, especially in England, to interpret and to theorize about. Americans were looked down upon as intellectually and sometimes physically degenerate and incapable of performing the heavy thinking work of the natural philosophers themselves. Of course, this is in contrast with what we now know, that the average American at the time was much healthier, lived longer, and was several inches taller than the average European. Benjamin Franklin would challenge the European view of the Americas. Franklin's social transformation into a gentleman epitomized the emergence of a new elite in British America, among whom merchants, lawyers, and master artisans featured prominently. Franklin created Philadelphia as the American exemplar of enlightenment. In establishing himself as a gentleman, Franklin made himself credible as a natural philosopher. His credibility stemmed from his ability to sell himself to the European aristocracy. In the course of his experiments with electricity, Franklin theorized that electricity could be explained through the electrical economy. Positive and negative charges in different bodies tried to restore equilibrium through the motion of electricity between the two bodies. When experimenting with Leyden jars, which were an early form of capacitor, Franklin tried to find concordances between the sparks produced by completing the circuit of the jar and lightning, and thus explain lightning through his theory about the electrical economy. Lightning, Franklin hypothesized, is the equalization of charges between the positively charged Earth and the negatively charged clouds. To test his hypothesis, Franklin set up a number of experiments to draw electricity from the clouds, beginning with his sentry box, atop which stood a tall iron rod, 20 to 30 feet in height, and later his kite experiment, when he realized that a wire on the sentry box was not nearly tall enough to reach high into the clouds. Sparks drawn from a key attached to the kite string by a silk ribbon produced similar bodily sensations as the sparks drawn off the static generators in Leyden jars, demonstrating the presence of electricity in the clouds. Franklin then made the intellectual leap from theory to practice. If the sensation is the same from the Leyden jar and the spark from the key, meaning that lightning is electricity, then one should be able to manipulate lightning like one manipulates electricity in the laboratory. From this, Franklin devised his idea for his conductor, lightning rod, to protect houses and other buildings from lightning strikes. In 1752, he had placed the first conductor on his Philadelphia house. Throughout the 1750s, Benjamin Franklin's friend and associate Ebenezer Kinnersley produced a series of public lectures on electricity which engaged the audience through participation in various experiments. Through the medium of these lectures, Kinnersley tried to sell the idea of Franklin's conductors with the demonstration of the Thunder House, a model house that was blown apart with the discharge from a Leyden jar to show that houses without conductors were at risk of catastrophic lightning strikes. Franklin did not patent his conductor. He and Kinnersley widely disseminated instructions for constructing and mounting them for the greater good of the public. Nevertheless, conductors were expensive and largely outside the capability of the poorer masses of America and Europe to purchase. They remained the domain of the wealthy, notably the gentlemen natural philosophers. Franklin spent most of his time in London from 1757 until March of 1775 as an unofficial ambassador for America, trying to mediate the problems between Britain and its colony. This task would prove fruitless, and Franklin would return home in 1775. During his brief stay in America, he would help draft the Declaration of Independence and would sign it before being sent to France in 1776. In France, Franklin turned his brilliant ability to sell himself to enamor the French aristocracy to his cause of independence of America from the British. With the help of John Adams, Franklin was able to persuade the French to aid the Americans in the cause of independence by 1778. French forces fighting in America during the American Revolutionary War would come to equal the number of Americans fighting in the Continental Army before the war's end. Franklin's efforts were vital to securing the alliance with France, without which the British would have easily put down the rebellion, and the United States would have remained British colonies. For the newly formed country, Benjamin Franklin provided one final bit of service when, in 1787, he served as the oldest delegate at the Constitutional Convention, helping to replace the Articles of Confederation with the new Constitution of the United States, which one can hope will prove to be as successful as many of Franklin's other achievements. On the 17th of April, 1790, Benjamin Franklin, great American statesman, inventor, and civic leader, dropped his mortal coil.